Scientology, The Fundamentals of Thought by L. Ron Hubbard. Forward. This thin book is a summation, if brief, of the results of 50,000 years of thinking men. Their materials, researched and capped by a quarter of a century of original search by L. Ron Hubbard, have brought the humanities, so long outdistanced by the exact sciences, into a state of equality, if not superiority, to physics, chemistry, and mathematics. Mr. Hubbard, an American, studied nuclear physics at George Washington University in Washington, D.C., before he started his studies about the mind, spirit, and life. This explains the mathematical precision of the Scientology religion. What has been attempted by 1,000 universities and foundations at a cost of billions has been completed quietly here. This is how life works. This is how you change men and women and children for the better. The use or neglect of this material may well determine the use or neglect of the atomic bomb by man. Scientology is already winning in this field. In the same period in history, two of the most sweeping forces man has known have come to fruition: a knowledge of himself and others with Scientology, a means of destroying himself and all others by atomic fission. Which force wins depends in a large measure on your use of Scientology. Equipped with this book alone, the student of Scientology can begin a practice and perform seeming miracles in changing the states of well-being, ability, and intelligence of people. No such knowledge has ever before existed, and no such results have ever before been attainable by man as those which can be reached by a study of this brief volume. Give this book to a man or a woman in trouble, a man or a woman with an inquiring nature, a man or a woman with associates who need a better life, and let that man or woman study this volume carefully and apply it. Change and a better life will result. Scientology is today around the world, represented on every continent on earth, with hundreds of millions of books in circulation. We trust you will find this volume of use, and hope that by placing it in your hands, you and many others can lead better lives. Note on translations. The text of this book was organized so that a complete translation of all of it would deliver, without interruption or destructive change, the basics of Scientology into every language. The difficulties of translation were most apparent when one was asked to translate Scientology who had not had years of experience with it. A translation not based on experience would then be colored by the various misunderstandings of the translator, and when the work passed, translated, into the hands of someone for use or study in that tongue, the person was deprived of much of the precision of Scientology. Thus, in order to secure exact meanings, all words and some phrases of questionable status in translation were given in synonym. Preface. Scientology and Scientologists are not revolutionaries. They are evolutionaries. They do not stand for overthrow. They stand for the improvement of what we have. Scientology is not political. When the fires of ideology threaten to consume us all, it is time to forget politics and seek reason. The mission of Scientology is not conquest. It is civilization. It is a war upon stupidity, the stupidity which leads us toward the last war of all. To a Scientologist, the real barbarism of earth is stupidity. Only in the black muck of ignorance can the irrational conflicts of ideologies germinate. Government to a Scientologist is a thing of reason, and all problems of government can be resolved by reason. Perhaps in yesterday one could afford the exploitation of ignorance for the sake of fancied gain. Perhaps in yesterday the study of the mind and reason was something for a summer afternoon. Perhaps in that same yesterday one amongst us could afford his irresponsibility and hate. But that was yesterday. Today, exploited ignorance, a dilettante attitude toward existing knowledge, a refusal to assume one's role as a responsible member of the human race may be punished in the searing thunderclap of H-bombs released by men whose intelligence and statecraft were incapable of a better solution. Ignorant people elect ignorant rulers, and only ignorant rulers lead to war. And this time will lead to a war which will bring silence forever after to Earth. As your associates, their homes, their children, their possessions, and all their future lie ending in a radioactive street, there won't be time for us to wish we'd worked harder, been less easily dissuaded from pressing our arguments. The copies of this book you did not distribute will lie there too. Some say they have no fear of death until the midnight of their dying is at hand. They say different then. Those who strike at this work out of some black well of ideological misorientation, some anti-social cravenness, strike at the heart of man, for man has been a long time on the track to reason, and Scientology can take him there. There is not much earth time. We must work. The criminal is ignorant and stupid. Ignorance and stupidity may therefore be called criminal. Cause man to lay aside his hates and listen. Freedom from ignorance is at hand. Perhaps that was the kingdom of heaven. There is not much earth time in which to distribute this knowledge. This is the solution to our barbarism, out of which we would lose all. Scientology works. We must work, all of us, not to harangue man toward impossible freedoms, but to make man civilized enough to be worthy of his freedom. It is time man grew up. That is what we have in mind, for there can be but weeping in the night where ignorance, factionalism, hatred, and exploitation are served by the most ferocious and final weapon of all, the H-bomb. Change no man's religion, change no man's politics, interrupt the sovereignty of no nation. Instead, teach man to use what he has and what he knows to the factual creation within any political reference of a civilization on earth for the first time. And so we work. Scientology, questions and answers. What is Scientology? Scientology embraces and treats of human ability. The term Scientology is taken from the Latin word scio, knowing in the fullest meaning of the word, and the Greek word logos, study of. Scientology is further defined as the study and handling of the spirit in relationship to itself, universes, and other life. Dianetics is a forerunner and sub-study of Scientology. Dianetics comes from the Greek words dia, through, and nous, mind or soul. Dianetics is what the soul is doing to the body. Neither Dianetics nor Scientology should be confused with modern psychology. More acceptable and normal psychology, such as that begun by St. Thomas Aquinas and extended by many later authors, was, in 1879, interrupted severely by one Professor Wundt, a Marxist at Leipzig University in Germany. This man conceived that man was an animal without soul and based all of his work on the principle that there was no psyche, a Greek word meaning spirit. Psychology, the study of the spirit, then came into the peculiar position of being a study of the spirit which denied the spirit. For the subsequent decades, Wundtian quote-unquote psychology was taught broadly throughout the world. It taught that man was an animal. It taught that man could not be bettered. It taught that intelligence never changed. This subject, Wundtian psychology, became standard mainly because of the indifference or lack of knowledge of people in charge of universities. Scientology is actually a new but very basic psychology, in the most exact meaning of the word, a study of the spirit. It can and does change behavior and intelligence, and it can and does assist people to study life. Unlike Wundtian pseudo-psychology, it has no political aspiration. Scientology is not teaching dialectical materialism, the Marxist theory that all things are material, including the mind and spirit, under the heading of psychology. As has been the tradition for thousands of years, the study of the spirit and all spiritual matters rightfully belong to religion. Scientology, used by the trained and untrained person, can improve the health, intelligence, ability, behavior, skill, and appearance of people. The Scientology religion is precise and exact, designed for an age of exact sciences. Scientology is employed by an auditor, a Scientology practitioner. The word auditor means one who listens, a listener. The auditor uses a set of processes, drills, and exercises upon individuals or small and large groups of people in their presence. The auditor makes these people, at their choice, do various exercises, processes, and these exercises bring about changes for the better in intelligence, behavior, and general competence. Scientology is employed as well by business and government persons to solve problems and to establish better organizations. It is also employed by the average person to bring better order into life. How is Scientology used? Scientology is employed by an auditor, one who listens, a listener, as a set of drills, exercises, processes upon the individual and small or large groups. It is also employed as an educational, teaching subject. It has been found that persons can be processed, drilled in Scientology, with Scientology exercises, and can be made well of many, many psychosomatic illnesses, physical illnesses caused by the mind or spirit, and can become brighter, more alert, and more competent. But if they are only processed, they have a tendency to be overwhelmed or startled. And although they may be brighter and more competent, they are still held down by an ignorance of life. Therefore, it is far better to teach and process, audit, drill a person than only to process him. In other words, the best use of Scientology is through processing and education in Scientology. In this way, there is no imbalance. It is interesting that people only need to study Scientology to have some small rise in their own intelligence, behavior, and competence. The study itself is therapeutic by actual testing. Scientology is also used by business and government leaders to establish or improve organization. It is used as well by the individual at home or at his work to make a better life. Can a person use Scientology without much study? Scientology is practiced in daily life by enormous numbers of people who have no formal training beyond a study of textbooks. Scientology was developed to be used by such people as well as by the trained practitioner. A person studying by himself from textbooks can use Scientology to help his fellow human beings. Where is there more information about Scientology? There are churches of Scientology located on every continent throughout the world. Addresses can be found at the back of this book. Scientology practitioners are validated, certified, and given certificates by these organizations. Certificates are given only after very exact and precise training. A person who is skilled in Scientology has a certificate from one of these church organizations. These offices and these people can give you more information about Scientology. They have many books on the subjects of Scientology and Dianetics and the various services offered by churches of Scientology. Part 1. Basic Principles. Chapter 1. Basic Principles. Like engineering, Scientology has certain basic principles. These are necessary to a full understanding of the subject. It is not enough to know how to process, drill people in Scientology. To be effective, good, one must also know the basic principles. Scientology is very exact. The humanities, human studies, of the past were full of opinions. Scientology is full of facts that work. To study Scientology, one should scan quickly through the basics and find something with which one can agree. Having found one thing, one fact, with which he can agree, one should then skim through again and find another fact. One should continue to do this until he feels some friendliness to the subject. When one has achieved this, and only when one has achieved this, he should then study all the basic principles. There is no effort here to be authoritarian. No one will try to make the subject difficult. You may have been taught that the mind, spirit, and life are very difficult things to know about. This is the first principle of Scientology. It is possible to know about the mind, the spirit, and life. Chapter 2. The Cycle of Action. The most fundamental idea in Scientology is called the cycle of action. Cycle means a span of time with a beginning and an end, meaning a section of the totality of time with a beginning and an end, meaning in beginningless and endless time, one can set out periods which do have a beginning and an end, insofar as action is concerned. Action means motion or movement, meaning an act, meaning a consideration that motion has occurred. In very ancient books, it is written that from chaos came birth. From birth there was growth. When growth was achieved, there was then a gradual decay. The decay then ended in death. After death, there was chaos. Scientology expresses this more briefly. The cycle of action is an apparency as follows: create, then survive, then destroy, or creation, survival, destruction. First there is creation. This is then followed by survival. This is followed by destruction. Apparency means appears to be, as distinct from what actually is. This cycle is only an apparency. It is what we see, what we behold, what we believe. We consider, think, believe, suppose that it is so, and we then see it so. A child is born, he grows, he reaches manhood, he grows old, he dies. In Scientology, it can be seen that none of these steps are necessary. One considers them so, and so they are true. A man can grow old quickly or slowly. He grows old to the degree that he believes he is growing old. Because everyone agrees that this is the way things are, they go that way. The cycle is not true. It is only apparent. It is apparent because we believe we see it. It is apparent because we agree that it should be so. The test of this principle is as follows. By using the cycle of action, can we make anyone well or more intelligent? Thousands of tests have proven that the use of and belief in the cycle of action has made none well or intelligent. Therefore, no matter if we see it, there must be something wrong with it. The woman growing old, wishing to appear younger, is protesting this cycle of action. She feels there is something wrong with it. There is. We have to find out what the actual cycle is before we can make people better. Actual means what is really true, meaning that which exists despite all apparencies, meaning that which underlies the way things seem to be, meaning the way things really are. The actual cycle of action is as follows. Create, 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 counter-create, no creation, nothingness. Create means make, manufacture, construct, postulate, bring into beingness, meaning create. Create, create, create means create again continuously, one moment after the next, meaning survive. Create, counter-create means to create something against a creation, meaning to create one thing and then create something else against it, meaning destroy. No creation means an absence of any creation, meaning no creative activity. An actual cycle of action, then, consists of various activities, but each and every one of them is creative. The cycle of action contains an apparency of survival, but this is actually only a continuous creation, create, create, create. The apparent cycle of action contains destruction, but the actual cycle of action tells us what destruction is. Destruction is one of two activities. Destruction is, in terms of action, a creation of something against a creation of something else, create, countercreate. For example, a wall is seen standing. To be apparent, it is necessary that the wall be constantly created. The act of destruction is to exert against the wall another creativeness, that is, the action or activity of knocking the wall down. Both the wall standing there and the action of knocking it down are creative actions. Because we may object to or dislike a wall being knocked down, we vilify the creativeness involved in knocking it down with the word destructive. Actuality tells us that there is no such thing as destruction. There is only creation against a creation. There is another type of destruction, and this is no more creation, no creation. By no longer being a party to the wall's creation, the wall in theory can cease to exist for one. This is true in actual practice in Scientology. Reality means the way things appear, meaning reality is apparency. To do anything about reality, one must search into and discover what underlies the apparency. Of what does reality consist? What is reality composed of? We see an apparency which has the cycle of action of create, survive, destroy. More basically, this cycle of action contains nothing but creation. If one stops making something completely and ceases to be a party to its manufacture, it no longer exists for one. If one ceases to create, there is nothingness. When one creates something or beholds something which is created, that thing is still being created. Even if one is creating something with his left hand and has forgotten about it with his right hand, the thing still exists. In other words, one can create something without knowing it is still being created. Then one seeks to destroy it by a counter-creation, a creation against it. The result is a chaos created by two opposing creations. Let us be practical. A theory is no good unless it works. All the fancy and beautiful theory in the world is useless unless it has a use or a workability. Is this cycle of action theory useful? It is. So long as we believe that we have to destroy with force in order to destroy at all, as long as we think in terms of destruction, we have chaos. There is creating and knowing one is creating. There is creating and not knowing one is creating. When one drives a car or a cart, he does many things which he is not aware of, conscious of, knowing about, and these we call automatic actions. One is doing something and is not aware that he is doing it. One starts to create something, then places this thought, still active, beyond his own reach, and the creation continues to occur. Knowingly creating something is always the first condition. One can then purposefully continue the creation unknowingly. Everything one is doing, knowingly or unknowingly, one is doing here and now, in the present instant, in present time. One knowingly started any creation in some past moment, but the creation is being done in the present moment. To stop any creation, it can be established that one once knew one was creating it, finding that thought, and making it known again. Or one can simply create newly and consciously what one is already creating unconsciously, unknowingly. In either case, the creation stops. The wrong way is to start a new creation to counter against the old creation. When one does this, he gets confusion and chaos. For example, a man has a bad leg. He is trying to get well. He seeks then to create a good leg. He goes to doctors and wants to be healed. The treatment is difficult and usually somewhat unsuccessful in the case of a very severely crippled leg. Something is creating a bad leg. Against this, he is creating a good leg. The result is confusion and a bad leg. But a third creativeness is present. First, something was creating, we hope, a good leg. Then a counter-creation, such as an accident to his leg, counter-created a bad leg. Now he is trying to counter-create again a good leg. The result, is to wipe out the original good leg, since that is the creation he is taking over and exposing with his efforts to get well. He wants a good leg. The trouble with him is the counter-creation of a bad leg. The test is factual. Have him create, by a certain Scientology process, bad legs, until the counter-creation of bad legs is wiped out and the original creation of a good leg will reappear. This only fails when there is no original creation of a good leg. For example, a man has a job. He works at it. That is to say, he creates a job throughout the days, weeks, and years. As long as he makes a job, the job exists. One day he depends upon, takes for granted, this job. He no longer creates it. It ceases to exist. He has no job. The apparency is that he loafed, became lazy, and was discharged. The actuality is that he no longer created a job and so didn't have one. For example, a man depends upon a woman to keep his house for him. One day he no longer has a woman. He can't keep house even though before he married the woman he could keep house. For example, a man is sane. He gets the idea, creates the idea, that it would be better to be insane. He starts to go insane, having created it, and then does numberless things in order to stay sane. Here, he was already creating the state of sanity. He counter-created insanity. He then counter-created sanity against insanity. Creation in this work may be thought to exclude God. We are here considering only those things which man or man as a spirit can make or manufacture or think. The subject of who or what is doing the creation does not invalidate the cycle. This is a work on the subject of the mind, spirit, and life, not a work on the subject of the Supreme Being. Lying is the lowest order of creativity. There are many tests for these principles in Scientology. Such tests come under the heading of processing. Chapter 3. The Conditions of Existence. There are 3 conditions of existence. These 3 conditions comprise, make up, constitute life. They are be, do, and have. The first condition of existence is being. Being is defined as the assumption, choosing, of a category of identity. It could be said to be the role in a game. An example of beingness could be one's own name. Another example would be one's profession. Another example would be one's physical characteristics. Each or all of these things could be called one's beingness. Beingness is assumed by oneself, or given to oneself, or is attained. For example, in the playing of a game, each player has his own beingness. The second condition of existence is doing. By doing we mean action, function, accomplishment, the attainment of goals, the fulfilling of purpose, or any change of position in space. The third condition of existence is havingness. By havingness we mean owning, possessing, being capable of commanding, positioning, taking charge of objects, energies, or spaces. The essential definition of having is to be able to touch or permeate or to direct the disposition of. The game of life demands that one assumes a beingness in order to accomplish a doingness in the direction of havingness. These 3 conditions are given in an order of seniority, importance, where life is concerned. The ability to be is more important than the ability to do. The ability to do is more important than the ability to have. In most people, all 3 conditions are sufficiently confused that they are best understood in reverse order. When one has clarified the idea of havingness or possession, one can then proceed to clarify doingness or general activity. And when this is done, one understands beingness or identity. It is essential to a successful existence that each of these 3 conditions be clarified and understood. The ability to assume or to grant, give, allow, beingness is probably the highest of human virtues. It is even more important to be able to permit other people to have beingness than to be able oneself to assume it. Chapter 4. The 8 Dynamics. As one looks out across the confusion which is life or existence to most people, one can discover 8 main divisions, to each of which apply the conditions of existence. Each division also contains a cycle of action. There could be said to be 8 urges, drives, impulses in life. These we call dynamics. These are motives or motivations. We call them the 8 dynamics. There is no thought or statement here that any one of these 8 dynamics is more important than the others. While they are categories, divisions of the broad game of life, they are not necessarily equal to each other. It will be found amongst individuals that each person stresses one of the dynamics more than the others, or may stress a combination of dynamics as more important than other combinations. The purpose in setting forth this division is to increase an understanding of life by placing it in compartments. Having subdivided existence in this fashion, each compartment can be inspected as itself and by itself in its relationship to the other compartments of life. In working a puzzle, it is necessary to first take pieces of similar color or character and place them in groups. In studying a subject, it is necessary to proceed in an orderly fashion. To promote this orderliness, it is necessary to assume, for our purposes, these 8 arbitrary compartments of life. The first dynamic is the urge toward existence as oneself. Here we have individuality expressed fully. This can be called the self-dynamic. The second dynamic is the urge toward existence as a sexual activity. This dynamic actually has 2 divisions. Second dynamic A is the sexual act itself, and the second dynamic B is the family unit, including the rearing of children. This can be called the sex dynamic. The third dynamic is the urge toward existence in groups of individuals. Any group or part of an entire class could be considered to be a part of the third dynamic. The school, the society, the town, the nation are each part of the third dynamic, and each one is a third dynamic. This can be called the group dynamic. The fourth dynamic is the urge toward existence as or of mankind. Whereas one race would be considered a third dynamic, all the races would be considered the fourth dynamic. This can be called the mankind dynamic. The fifth dynamic is the urge toward existence of the animal kingdom. This includes all living things, whether vegetable or animal, the fish in the sea, the beasts of the field or of the forest, grass, trees, flowers, or anything directly and intimately motivated by life. This can be called the animal dynamic. The sixth dynamic is the urge toward existence as the physical universe. The physical universe is composed of matter, energy, space, and time. In Scientology, we take the first letter of each of these words and coin a word, MEST. This can be called the universe dynamic. The seventh dynamic is the urge toward existence as or of spirits. Anything spiritual, with or without identity, would come under the heading of the seventh dynamic. This can be called the spiritual dynamic. The eighth dynamic is the urge toward existence as infinity. This is also identified as the supreme being. This is called the eighth dynamic because the symbol of infinity stood upright makes the numeral 8. This can be called the infinity or God dynamic. Scientologists usually call these by number. The earlier subject, Dianetics, included dynamics 1 to 4. Scientology embraces dynamics 1 through 7 as known territory, scientifically demonstrated and classified. The difficulty of stating the exact definitions of the dynamics is entirely verbal. Originally, the dynamics read the urge toward survival as blank. As the subject developed, it became apparent that survival was only an apparency and only one facet of existence. Both the cycle of action and the three conditions of existence belong in each dynamic. A further manifestation of these dynamics is that they could best be represented as a series of concentric circles, wherein the first dynamic would be the center and each new dynamic would be successively a circle outside it. The idea of space expanding enters into these dynamics. The basic characteristic of the individual includes his ability to so expand into the other dynamics. But when the seventh dynamic is reached in its entirety, one will only then discover the true eighth dynamic. As an example of use of these dynamics, one discovers that a baby at birth is not perceptive beyond the first dynamic, but as the child grows and interests extend, the child can be seen to embrace other dynamics. As a further example of use, a person who is incapable of operating on the third dynamic is incapable at once of being a part of a team, and so might be said to be incapable of a social existence. As a further comment upon the 8 dynamics, no one of these dynamics, from 1 to 7, is more important than any other one of them in terms of orienting the individual. While the dynamics are not of equal importance, one to the next, the ability of an individual to assume the beingness, doingness, and havingness of each dynamic is an index to his ability to live. The 8 dynamics are used in Scientology communication and should be perfectly learned as part of the language of Scientology. The abilities and shortcomings of individuals can be understood by viewing their participation in the various dynamics. Chapter 5. The ARC Triangle. There is a triangle of considerable importance in Scientology, and an ability to use it gives a much greater understanding of life. The ARC triangle is the keystone of living associations. This triangle is the common denominator to all of life's activities. The first corner of the triangle is called affinity. The basic definition of affinity is the consideration of distance, whether good or bad. The most basic function of complete affinity would be the ability to occupy the same space as something else. The word affinity is here used to mean love, liking, or any other emotional attitude. Affinity is conceived in Scientology to be something of many facets. Affinity is a variable quality. Affinity is here used as a word with the context degree of liking. Under affinity, we have the various emotional tones ranged from the highest to the lowest, and these are in part serenity, the highest level, enthusiasm, conservatism, as we proceed downward towards the baser affinities, boredom, antagonism, anger, covert hostility, fear, grief, apathy. This in Scientology is called the tone scale. Below apathy, affinity proceeds into solidities such as matter. Affinity is conceived to be comprised first of thought, then of emotion, which contains energy particles, and then as a solid. The second corner of the triangle is reality. Reality could be defined as that which appears to be. Reality is fundamentally agreement. What we agree to be real is real. The third corner of the triangle is communication. In understanding the composition of human relations in this universe, communication is more important than the other 2 corners of the triangle. Communication is the solvent for all things. It dissolves all things. The interrelationship of the triangle becomes apparent at once when one asks, have you ever tried to talk to an angry man? Without a high degree of liking and without some basis of agreement, there is no communication. Without communication and some basis of emotional response, there can be no reality. Without some basis for agreement and communication, there can be no affinity. Thus, we call these 3 things a triangle. Unless we have 2 corners of a triangle, there cannot be a third corner. Desiring any corner of the triangle, one must include the other 2. The triangle is conceived to be very spacious at the level of serenity and completely condensed at the level of matter. Thus, to represent a scale for use, one would draw a large triangle with the high part of the scale and succeedingly smaller triangles down to a dot at the bottom of the scale. Affinity, reality, and communication are the basis of the Scientology tone scale, which gives a prediction of human behavior. The tone scale, its complete description and use, is contained in Science of Survival. As has already been noted, the triangle is not an equilateral, all sides the same, triangle. Affinity and reality are very much less important than communication. It might be said that the triangle begins with communication, which brings into existence affinity and reality. ARC, understanding. If you would continue a strong and able communication with someone, there must be some basis for agreement. There must be some liking for the person, and then communication can exist. We can see then that simple talking and writing randomly without knowledge of this would not necessarily be communication. Communication is essentially something which is sent and which is received. The intention to send and the intention to receive must both be present in some degree before an actual communication can take place. Therefore, one could have conditions which appear to be communications which were not. The complete manual of communication is Dianetics 55. Original with Scientology, as are all these concepts, the ARC triangle, understood, is an extremely useful tool or weapon in human relationships. For instance, amongst the ARC triangle laws, a communication to be received must approximate the affinity level of the person to whom it is directed. As people descend the tone scale, they become more and more difficult to communicate with, and things with which they will agree become more and more solid. Thus, we have friendly discourses high on the scale and war at the bottom. Where the affinity level is hate, the agreement is solid matter, and the communication, bullets. Chapter 6. The Reason Why. Life can best be understood by likening it to a game. Since we are exterior to a great number of games, we can regard them with a detached eye. If we were exterior to life, instead of being involved and immersed in the living of it, it would look to us much like games look to us from our present vantage point. Despite the amount of suffering, pain, misery, sorrow, and travail which can exist in life, the reason for existence is the same reason as one has to play a game: interest, contest, activity, and possession. The truth of this assertion is established by an observation of the elements of games and then applying these elements to life itself. When we do this, we find nothing left wanting in the panorama of life. By game, we mean contest of person against person or team against team. When we say games, we mean such games as baseball, polo, chess, or any other such pastime. It may at one time have struck you peculiar that men would risk bodily injury in the field of play just for the sake of amusement. So it might strike you as peculiar that people would go on living or would enter into the game of life at the risk of all the sorrow, travail, and pain just to have something to do. Evidently, there is no greater curse than total idleness. Of course, there is that condition where a person continues to play a game in which he is no longer interested. If you will but look about the room and check off items in which you are not interested, you will discover something remarkable. In a short time, you will find that there is nothing in the room in which you are not interested. You are interested in everything. However, disinterest itself is one of the mechanisms of play. In order to hide something, it is only necessary to make everyone disinterested in the place where the item is hidden. Disinterest is not an immediate result of interest which has worn out. Disinterest is a commodity in itself. It is palpable. It exists. By studying the elements of games, we find ourselves in possession of the elements of life. Life is a game. A game consists of freedom, barriers, and purposes. This is a scientific fact, not merely an observation. Freedom exists amongst barriers. A totality of barriers and a totality of freedom alike are no-game conditions. Each is similarly cruel. Each is similarly purposeless. Great revolutionary movements fail. They promise unlimited freedom. That is the road to failure. Only stupid visionaries chant of endless freedom. Only the afraid and ignorant speak of and insist upon unlimited barriers. When the relation between freedom and barriers becomes too unbalanced, an unhappiness results. Freedom from is all right, only so long as there is a place to be free to. An endless desire for freedom from is a perfect trap, a fear of all things. Barriers are composed of inhibiting, limiting ideas, space, energy, masses, and time. Freedom in its entirety would be a total absence of these things. But it would also be a freedom without thought or action, an unhappy condition of total nothingness. Fixed on too many barriers, man yearns to be free. But launched into total freedom, he is purposeless and miserable. There is freedom amongst barriers. If the barriers are known and the freedoms are known, there can be life, living, happiness, a game. The restrictions of a government or a job give an employee his freedom. Without known restrictions, an employee is a slave doomed to the fears of uncertainty in all his actions. Executives in business and government can fail in 3 ways and thus bring about a chaos in their department. They can 1. Seem to give endless freedom, 2. Seem to give endless barriers, 3. Make neither freedom nor barriers certain. Executive competence, therefore, consists of imposing and enforcing an adequate balance between their people's freedom and the unit's barriers, and in being precise and consistent about those freedoms and barriers. Such an executive, adding only in himself initiative and purpose, can have a department with initiative and purpose. An employee buying and or insisting upon freedom only will become a slave. Knowing the above facts, he must insist upon a workable balance between freedom and barriers. An examination of the dynamics, Chapter 4, will demonstrate the possibility of a combination of teams. 2 group dynamics can engage one another as teams. The self dynamic can ally itself with the animal dynamic against, let us say, the universe dynamic, and so have a game. In other words, the dynamics are an outline of possible teams and interplays. As everyone is engaged in several games, an examination of the dynamics will plot and clarify for him the various teams he is playing upon and those he is playing against. If an individual can discover that he is only playing on the self-dynamic and that he belongs to no other team, it is certain that this individual will lose. For he has before him 7 remaining dynamics, and the self-dynamic is seldom capable of besting, by itself, all the remaining dynamics. In Scientology, we call this condition the only one. Here is self-determinism in the guise of selfish determinism. And here is an individual who will most certainly be overwhelmed. To enjoy life, one must be willing to be some part of life. There is the principle in Scientology called pan-determinism. This could be loosely defined as determining the activities of 2 or more sides in a game simultaneously. For instance, a person playing chess is being self-determined and is playing chess against an opponent. A person who is pan-determined on the subject of chess could play both sides of the board. A being is pan-determined about any game to which he is senior. He is self-determined only in a game to which he is junior. For instance, a general of an army is pan-determined concerning an argument between 2 privates or even 2 companies of his command. He is pan-determined in this case, but when he confronts another army led by another general, he becomes self-determined. The game in this wise could be said to be larger than himself. The game becomes even larger than this when the general seeks to play the parts of all the political heads which should be above him. This is the main reason why dictatorship doesn't work. It is all but impossible for one man to be pan-determined about the entire system of games which comprise a nation. He starts taking sides, and then, to that degree, becomes much less than the government which he is seeking to run. It has been stylish in past ages to insist only upon freedom. The French Revolution furnishes an excellent example for this. In the late part of the 18th century, the nobles of France became so self-determined against the remainder of the country and were so incapable of taking the parts of the populace that the nobles were destroyed. Immediately, the populace itself sought to take over the government, and being untrained and being intensely antipathetic to any and all restraints, their war cry became freedom. They had no further restrictions or barriers. The rules of government were thrown aside. Theft and brigandage took the place of economics. The populace, therefore, found itself in a deeper trap and discovered itself to be involved with a dictatorship which was far more restrictive than anything they had experienced before the Revolution. Although man continually uses freedom for his war cry, he only succeeds in establishing further entrapment for himself. The reason for this is a very simple one. A game consists of freedom and barriers and purposes. When man drops the idea of restrictions or barriers, he loses at once control over barriers. He becomes self-determined about barriers and not pan-determined. Thus, he cannot control the barriers. The barriers left uncontrolled trap him then and there. The dwindling spiral of the apparency create, survive, destroy comes about directly when man shuns barriers. If he considers all restrictions and barriers his enemies, he is, of course, refusing to control them in any way, and thus he starts his own dwindling spiral. A race which is educated to think in terms of freedom only is very easily entrapped. No one in the nation will take responsibility for restrictions. Therefore, restrictions apparently become less and less. Actually, they become more and more. As these restrictions lessen, so lessens the freedom of the individual. One cannot be free from a wall unless there is a wall. Lacking any restrictions, life becomes purposeless, random, chaotic. A good manager must be capable of taking responsibility for restrictions, in that freedom, to exist, must have barriers. A failure to take initiative on the subject of restrictions or barriers causes them to arise all by themselves and exist without consent or direction. There are various states of mind which bring about happiness. That state of mind which insists only upon freedom can bring about nothing but unhappiness. It would be better to develop a thought pattern which looked for new ways to be entrapped and things to be trapped in, than to suffer the eventual total entrapment of dwelling upon freedom only. A man who is willing to accept restrictions and barriers and is not afraid of them is free. A man who does nothing but fight restrictions and barriers will usually be trapped. The way to have endless war is abandon all war. As it can be seen in any game, purposes become counterposed. There is a matter of purpose, counterpurpose in almost any game played in a field with two teams. One team has the idea of reaching the goal of the other, and the other has the idea of reaching the goal of the first. Their purposes are at war, and this warring of purposes makes a game. The war of purposes gives us what we call problems. A problem has the anatomy of purposes. A problem consists of two or more purposes opposed. It does not matter what problem you face or have faced. The basic anatomy of that problem is purpose, counterpurpose. In actual testing, in Scientology, it has been discovered that a person begins to suffer from problems when he does not have enough of them. There is the old maxim, that if you want a thing done, give it to a busy man to do. Similarly, if you want a happy associate, make sure that he is a man who can have lots of problems. From this, we get the oddity of a high incidence of neurosis in the families of the rich. These people have very little to do and have very few problems. The basic problems of food, clothing, and shelter are already solved for them. We would suppose, then, if it were true that an individual's happiness depended only upon his freedom, these people would be happy. However, they are not happy. What brings about their unhappiness? It is the lack of problems. Although successful processing in Scientology would depend upon taking all three elements of games into consideration, and indeed that is the secret of bettering people, taking freedom, barriers, and purposes into consideration and balancing them, it is true that you could make a man well simply by sitting down with him and asking him to invent problems one after the other. The invention of synthetic problems would be found to free his mind and make him more able. Of course, there is another factor involved in this. In that it is he who is inventing the problems, he is therefore becoming pan-determined about problems rather than being in one place with all problems opposed to him. An unhappy man is one who is considering continually how to become free. One sees this in the clerk who is continually trying to avoid work. Although he has a great deal of leisure time, he is not enjoying any part of it. He is trying to avoid contact with people, objects, energies, and spaces. He eventually becomes trapped in a sort of lethargy. If this man could merely change his mind and start worrying about how he could get more work to do, his happiness level would increase markedly. One who is plotting continually how to get out of things will become miserable. One who is plotting how to get into things has a much better chance of becoming happy. There is, of course, the matter of being forced to play games in which one has no interest. A war into which one is drafted is an excellent example of this. One is not interested in the purposes of the war, and yet one finds himself fighting it. Thus, there must be an additional element. And this element is the power of choice. One could say, then, that life is a game, and that the ability to play a game consists of tolerance for freedom and barriers, and an insight into purposes with the power of choice over participation. These four elements, freedom, barriers, purposes, and power of choice, are the guiding elements of life. There are only two factors above these, and both of them are related to these. The first is the ability to create, with, of course, its negative, the ability to uncreate. And the second is the ability to make a postulate, to consider, to say a thing, and have it be true. This, then, is the broad picture of life, and in bringing life into focus and in making it less confusing, these elements are used in its understanding.